historians Joseph Ellis and Pauline Mayer, novelist Don DeLillo, and best-selling writer John Krakauer. From a Book Notes interview of last year, Jack Rakove talks about his book, Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution. And then a book discussion group talks about Mr. Rakove's book. Also, Pulitzer Prize-winning author David Halberstam and his new book, The Children, about the young men and women of the civil rights movement in Nashville. And historian Jill Lepore talks about the implications of King Philip's War, a 17th century conflict between Massachusetts colonists and Native Americans. Sunday night at 9 Eastern and Pacific, we'll show you this year's National Book Critics Circle Awards ceremony. 24 hours about books, beginning Saturday night, April 4th.
Now Robert Kinloch Massey discusses his book, Loosing the Bonds, the United States and South Africa in the Apartheid Years. Mr. Massey is the executive director of the Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Economics and was the Democratic nominee for lieutenant governor in Massachusetts in 1994. He spoke at the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston, where he was introduced by his father, the historian Robert K. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. As you just heard, my name is Robert Massey, but I'm not the one you came to hear, so I will make this brief. But I did have something to do with this primary speaker being here today. And so also did Suzanne Massey, his mother, who was sitting in front. And also here today is Bob's wife, Anne, and his son, John, all of whom have something to do with the person that he is. My son is a graduate of Princeton, 1978, and Yale Divinity School, 1982. After ordination as a priest in the Episcopal Church, he served for 2 years in the parish ministry at Grace Church on Lower Broadway in New York City. And then he came to Boston in 1984 to begin work on a doctorate in business policy and business ethics at the Harvard Business School. In 1987, he became one of the first fellows in Harvard University's program in ethics and the professions. And during these studies, he also served as the priest in charge for 3 years of an Episcopal parish in Somerville. After completing his doctorate in 1989, he taught for 2 years as a visiting lecturer in ethics and public policy at Harvard Divinity School. Then he was the Henry Luce Fellow in Theology and Director of Program in Business Values and Economy at the Divinity School. As most of you know, or at least some of you know, he was the Democratic Party candidate for lieutenant governor in 1994, but the citizens of Massachusetts, in their wisdom, elected the other ticket. He has received an Albert Einstein Institution grant and a Fulbright Research grant, and he was on the faculty of the University of Cape Town for the better part of a year, several years ago. That's the official biography. A few notes. Somewhere in this biographical puzzle, I can't quite remember where, there was a year working for Senator Henry M. Jackson in Washington on Capitol Hill, and another year, or the better part of a year, working for Ralph Nader. So you see, given all these ingredients, this is a life committed to social action and social justice, to morality and ethics, applied to the everyday nitty-gritty of politics, corporate behavior, citizen involvement, or as Thomas Jefferson said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I remember that Paul Moore, the Episcopal Bishop of New York, who was at a celebration of this book a few days ago in New York City, had to confront my son before he was ordained, when Bob said to the bishop, "I don't know whether I should be ordained, Bishop. I have so many things I want to do, and I'm not sure that a ministry in the church will permit me to do all of these things. And the bishop said, on the contrary, the Episcopal Church must have, we want and need people who are willing to reach out to all these various parts of life that you are so eager to do. So this explains partly Harvard Divinity School and Yale Divinity School and Harvard Business School, the melding of what ought to be done and how we ought to live with how to get it done, the melding, merging of ideals and practicality. And what better subject to bring these two sides of life together than South Africa? American policy, government, business, church, institutions, students, citizens, to reach some kind of solution to this great moral, economic, and political struggle which was going on in that country, in which Senator Kennedy just spoke about so eloquently. One word about the book itself, and then I'm through. You will necessarily and properly discount what or rather discount, maybe by 30%, what I'm going to say because of my connection with the author. But I didn't read it until the bound galleys were available at the end of the summer. And I believe, having worked on this all my life, that great narrative history requires a great subject, considerable craft, and true commitment. I was certain when I picked up this book that it would be informative and that the information would be accurate. But this book is much more than that. This is, if you will accept my word, a true page-turner. It is superbly constructed. By that I mean just about the time you can't stand reading any more about what's going on in South Africa. You turn to what's going on in the United States, in the halls of Congress or various state legislatures, in corporate boardrooms, in student activist organizations. I remember that my son and a group of his fellows, Alan Fletcher is one of them who's here, took over Nassau Hall at Princeton to demand that the university divest itself of stocks and companies which did business in South Africa. All of this is in this book. And just about the time you can't believe or can't take any more American, what shall I say, corporate behavior, you go back to South Africa where things are much, much worse. But the book has a happy ending, or at least a happy ending insofar as we can have happy endings in our times and in our lives. I recommend that you get a copy somehow and read it. So I could go on, but that's not why you came here. So I have great pleasure in introducing to you the author, Robert Kinloch Massey.
Thank you very much. I have to say it's a marvelous experience to be here with so many friends from different parts of my life in this setting, following that speech of Robert Kennedy's and then those very touching words of my father. I'd like to begin with some thanks to various people. I'd like to begin particularly with thanks to John Stewart and the John F. Kennedy Library for extending this invitation and for the reception that will follow. Again, to my father and for his kind introduction, to my mother for making a special trip to be here, and to both of my parents for infusing me with a love of history and a sense of its urgency. To my wife, Anne, and my son, John, and the other members of our family who are here, I also offer thanks. I'm sorry that my son, Samuel, is not here today because he has the flu. Because he pretty much summed up the reaction of my family and friends to the publication of this book When I showed him the first copy, he turned it over in his hands, looked at me and said, "Wow, finally!" To everyone who came through the snow, I offer my deep appreciation, and especially to those who are here today who had their own important roles in the anti-apartheid struggle and who deserve far greater recognition than I was able to give. And finally, to all of you who have bought or are intending to buy my book, anyone who has written or who grew up in a family of writers can tell you what a special place you hold in an author's heart. I thought this afternoon I would try to answer a question I have been asked many times. Why did I take on this large and consuming project? For more than a decade, I dug my way through mountains of books and clippings and archives. I interviewed hundreds of people on 3 continents. I traveled from the spacious halls of the United States Congress to the cramped prison cells of Robben Island, from the airy penthouses of corporate America to the shadowy tunnels of the Witwatersrand gold mines. And when I ask myself what drove me to such lengths, I come up with 3 reasons. The first reason is that in some way, I think I am fundamentally stupid. I learned about South Africa for the first time 27 years ago when, as a teenager, I met a black South African exile who showed me and my family the rough cut of a documentary film about apartheid. What I saw, I simply could not understand. How could a nation exist in our time in which 5 million people with less pigment in their skin exercised total control over 20 million who had more? Though my incomprehension may have been a form of idealism or a naivete, for some reason my brain and my heart could not comprehend this. And I mean that in the full sense of being able to wrap my mind around it and take hold of it. Yet I wanted to comprehend it. As I looked more closely, I found facets from every field that interests me, as my father alluded to: economics and theology, politics, history, finance, race, and culture. Indeed, it seemed to me, as I came to understand this story, that I was uncovering some of the underlying forces that guide our interconnected world. And so I wanted to probe the tale in all its complexity, to track down every lead, to consider every angle, to give everyone with every point of view a fair hearing, to know all I could know, and then to distill it all down into a form to which anyone else could have access, which I have now done in a mere 600 pages. I came to see the anti-apartheid struggle as an epic with hundreds of characters in which everything was linked to everything else, and yet in which there was a clear narrative of the emergence of freedom as compelling and dramatic as any story I had ever heard. The second reason that expanded and sustained my interest was my delight at some of the peculiar anecdotes I found, and my deeper intellectual curiosity about the similarities and differences between the national experiences of the United States and South Africa. I found many unexpected connections between the 2 countries. To my amazement, I found that in the 19th century, clipper ships used to sail from snowbound Boston all the way to sun-baked Table Mountain so that the residents of Cape Town could cool their food and drink with ice cut from the lakes of Massachusetts. In the 1830s, an American preacher named Daniel Lindley traveled to South Africa and became the pastor not only to the Afrikaner settlers during the Great Trek, but also later to a group of Zulu Christians, one of whose sons became the founder of the African National Congress. By the turn of the century, many members of South Africa's African elite, including some of the early members of the ANC, had traveled all the way to the United States to obtain degrees from American colleges. In 1900, John F. Fitzgerald, the former mayor of Boston, member of Congress, and grandfather of President Kennedy, formally proposed on the floor of the House of Representatives that the United States send a fleet of steamships to South Africa to enable the Afrikaner people who are battling the British Army in the Boer War to resettle as a whole in Ohio. In the 1920s, Hendrik Verwoerd, the man who eventually became the leading theorist of apartheid and the prime minister who oversaw its brutal implementation, traveled with his wife to the United States. During his trip, he made a special point of visiting both Harvard and Harlem to explore and adapt American theories and practices of segregation to the South African context. Some of what I found were simply colorful anecdotes, but there were other, deeper, more telling connections. There were, as Robert F. Kennedy noted in his speech, the eerie parallels of history. The two former Dutch colonies, both expanding on a broad frontier, conquering indigenous peoples, importing slaves, breaking free from the British, and fighting fierce internal wars over political union. And there were also fundamental differences. The United States emerged from the Civil War with a renewed, though still imperfect, commitment to our constitutional principle of equality, while South Africa, after the Boer War, crafted a constitution that enshrined discrimination. Through the 20th century, there were the tightening bonds of politics and commerce as American corporations poured investment into South Africa after World War II, and as the American government exchanged information and material support, even as South Africa was implementing a vast, modernized system of racial domination. The parallels and ties I found were intriguing, troubling, worthy of further examination, yet apart from the work of scholars like George Fredrickson and John Sell, few historians had tried to draw connections between the two nations, and none had done so for the apartheid period. Even historians who focused on just one of the countries often examined only one thread. In South Africa, one finds books about the growth of Afrikaner nationalism and other books about the rise of African resistance, but up until recently, few thought it important that Hendrik Verwoerd and Nelson Mandela and their respective followers were living in the same country at the same time, reacting to each other's words and deeds. And similarly, in the United States, we find a split between those who write about foreign and domestic policy. I read one set of books about President Kennedy's foreign policy toward Africa, and another set about his role in the US civil rights movement, but the connections between the two were rarely discussed. It wasn't until I spent weeks in this building, immersed in the daily debate of cables and memos streaming in and out of the White House, that I saw how completely intertwined were domestic and foreign issues in the thinking of the president and his advisors. Let me give you three brief examples. John F. Kennedy had, during his presidential campaign, promised that the United States would lead the fight for democracy in the world. Kennedy repeatedly criticized Richard Nixon for the Eisenhower administration's failure to reach out to the new nations in Africa that were forming literally every month. In his inaugural address, Kennedy promised to pay any price and bear any burden in the defense of freedom. And as President Kennedy worked diligently to persuade African leaders and diplomats that the United States could be trusted to live up to its high principles, it did not help this goal that when many of these same African diplomats visited the United States, they were regularly thrown out of segregated restaurants in Maryland and elsewhere. And when violence erupted in the American South in the spring of 1963, Kennedy received protests from around the world, including this stiff message from the Prime Minister of Uganda, Milton Obote. Nothing is more paradoxical, Mr. President, than that the denial of civil rights should take place in the United States at a time when your country is anxious to project its image before the world as the archetype of democracy and the champion of freedom. Mr. President, the ears and eyes of the world are concentrated on Alabama. On another occasion, when U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson and Secretary of State Dean Rusk learned that Martin Luther King had been invited to speak before the UN Special Committee on Apartheid, they were so worried that it would cause irreparable damage to America's international reputation that they asked the President to intervene personally with Dr. King and ask him not to go. Kennedy did, and King subsequently declined the invitation. But it wasn't just in President Kennedy's mind that these two struggles were intertwined. Many people saw and spoke about the connections, including Dr. King, who as the years went by advocated for stronger and stronger action against South Africa. In a speech in New York in 1965, King described South Africa as a nation where, quote, a medieval segregation is organized with 20th century efficiency and drive. And yet, he said, American protest was so muted that it, quote, merely disturbs the sensibilities of the segregationists, while our trade and investment substantially stimulate their economy to greater heights. The shame of our nation, he said bluntly, is that it is objectively an ally of this monstrous government in its grim war against its own black people. At the time of this speech, King and other black leaders were planning a strategy to put economic pressure on American cities and states that continued to condone discrimination. And King himself proposed that this technique be extended to South Africa. Have we the power to be more than peevish with South Africa? King asked. To list our extensive economic relations with South Africa is to suggest a potent, nonviolent path, a massive international boycott. Martin Luther King made this suggestion just a few months before Robert F. Kennedy's visit to Cape Town. Indeed, the group to which Bobby Kennedy was speaking, the National Union of South African Students, had also invited King to come. But King was refused a visa by the South African government of Hendrik Verwoerd. In retaliation against the student leader who had issued these invitations, Ian Robertson, the government had placed him under house arrest, which is why Kennedy went to see him and why he mentioned him so pointedly in his address. And it is interesting to note that the deeper moral and economic connections of America to South Africa were also on Senator Kennedy's mind, especially after this trip. When he returned to the United States, he wrote a provocative article for Look magazine entitled, "What if God is Black?" And he sent a letter to American companies with subsidiaries in South Africa asking them to describe their employment practices over there. I could go on tracing these connections as I do in my book and will not here. I could describe how President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger, who were both preoccupied with the international struggle against the Kremlin, crafted a deliberate policy of rapprochement with the white supremacist regimes of Southern Africa. I could tell you how Stephen Biko and Alan Boesak and Desmond Tutu explicitly drew some of their ideas from the American experience and applied them to their own struggle. I could explain how the eruption of events in South Africa in the 1980s engaged a whole new generation of young activists and reinvigorated the American debate about race in the middle of what the New York Times referred to as the mumbling indifference of the Reagan administration. And scattered through the chapters like little hidden Waldos are some illustrative vignettes about the week in 1971, during which Randall Robinson, a student at Harvard Law School and later the leader of Trans-Africa, camped out in Derek Bok's office in protest over the university's investments in Southern Africa. About Leon Sullivan's decision in 1975 as he was standing naked during a strip search in a South African airport that he would go back to the United States and launch the Sullivan Principles. About the Massachusetts divestment bill that was vetoed by Governor Edward King, overturned by the legislature, and finally signed by Governor Michael Dukakis. About Teddy Kennedy's turbulent trip to South Africa in 1985 and his relentless battles in the United States Senate, and many other stories of people who are more and less well known. And of course, I included a description of Nelson Mandela's release in February 1990 after 10,000 days in jail, and his tumultuous visit to the United States in June, when the symbolic connections between the two national struggles with racism became fully and emotionally visible. So if it was partly my stupidity that started me down this path, and my fascination with the stories of similarity, difference, and interconnection that carried me through, the third and final reason I took on the project was because I wanted, after immersing myself in all of this material, to see what conclusions I could draw. And of course there are many, but I will mention three rather briefly that I think should stimulate us to new thinking and new action. The first conclusion is that many of the basic assumptions that drove politics and policy in the United States about South Africa were simply wrong. And that these errors prevented us from acting in our own best interest and according to our own best principles. For example, it was an article of faith of the American corporate and political elite for 3 decades that any pressure applied to the South African government would only backfire, hardening their resistance to reform. Even though South African history itself is full of examples of the Afrikaner people breaking under pressure into bickering schisms, which is in fact exactly what happened when sanctions finally began to bite. White American leaders acted on the mythological premise that economic pressures would be counterproductive. One wonders, as Desmond Tutu and Jesse Jackson have suggested, whether American policy would have been as cautious and smug if the racial balance in South Africa had been reversed. If it had been 5 million black citizens who argued that the preservation of Western democracy required them to deny all political and economic rights to 20 million white people. Would we have been so indifferent if the black oligarchs of South Africa had been relocating white families to arid rural dumping grounds, causing hundreds of thousands of white children to die of malnutrition? These questions should prompt us not only to re-examine our past mistakes, but to ask ourselves what mistakes we are now making because of our assumptions or our bias. Are we blithely assuming as a nation that trade with Burma or China will automatically bring improvements in human rights? Are we allowing ourselves to squander the inheritance of the biosphere because we assume that some unknown future technology will save us from the consequences of our own thoughtlessness and greed? These questions require vigilance and debate. As the great Western philosopher Yogi Berra has said, it's not the things we don't know that get us into trouble, it's the things we know for sure that just ain't so. The second conclusion we can draw is that the debate and the deliberations over America's relationship with South Africa were enduring precisely because, in effect, they were another chapter in the racial struggle that has defined America's national character. In millions of conversations, large and small, in boardrooms, over dinner tables, at public hearings, in committee meetings, at stockholder gatherings, in foundations, pensions funds, brokerage houses, universities, and union halls, Americans probed the boundaries of purpose and principle that shape our institutions and ultimately our nation. Over and over again, Americans asked each other how we should turn our words into deeds, our preaching into practice. Through this process, something extraordinary and exciting took place. Through these millions of discussions, America created a new, though still largely invisible system through which disputes about moral, political, and economic issues can be adjudicated. And this has even spilled onto Wall Street. America has now developed a rare, some might say unique, method that allows shareholders and executives who control huge pools of capital to respond to criteria other than immediate financial return and to questions about the longer horizon and deeper values by which an economy should be guided. The system is now being applied to many other issues, from challenging the conditions under which children labor in other countries to pushing for improved environmental disclosure and performance through the Ceres Coalition, of which I am now the executive director. To return to the question of race, though apartheid has ended, our process of self-assessment will not. The more Americans express devotion to democratic rule, commitment to individual rights, aspirations for an equal and prosperous society, confidence that America has a special destiny and duty, the more we are compelled to explore and to correct our own failures. President Clinton is trying to foster a national conversation on race, but his effort will not succeed unless we are willing to do the talking. For the United States, the struggle over South Africa was part of a much larger and ongoing challenge to determine whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, as Lincoln put it at Gettysburg, can be sustained. In conclusion, I want to return to the speech with which we began. Robert F. Kennedy's speech is considered by his biographers to have been one of the finest, if not the finest, orations of his life. In it, he said something that was not captured on the tape, but which stands as one of his most famous quotations and as a fitting conclusion for the entire story. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression. This is the single most important lesson we should draw from the story of the defeat of apartheid. There were many times when it seemed implausible, to say the least, that writing one letter or marching for one day or voting one share of stock would contribute to the erosion of one of the most brutally segregated societies in the history of the world. The clear-thinking journalists, the reasonable administrators, the world-weary political analysts, the hard-nosed executives, the flint-eyed foreign policy experts all insisted year after year that such acts could not have any effect. But the evidence I gathered over 10 years says otherwise. The evidence shows an unlikely chain reaction in which thousands of small acts of commitment and protest, each derided as inconsequential, steadily accumulated into a force that pressured the oppressors, gave encouragement to their victims, and eventually brought forth justice. Though it took a long time to emerge, the sequence of events through which average Americans contributed to South Africa's shift to freedom is now clear and incontrovertible. As students, church groups, unions, civil rights activists, and others forced hundreds of American institutions to wrestle with the ethics of their investments, these institutions steadily increased their pressure on American companies to withdraw. Eventually, state and local legislators joined the effort, passing more than 100 laws, forcing their treasuries to sell off stock or bypass the products of corporations with South African subsidiaries. These measures, added to the unimaginable tenacity of black resistance in the face of violence by the South African government, led directly to the refusal of banks to roll over South Africa's foreign debt in 1985, to the passage of a sanctions bill in 1986 over Ronald Reagan's veto, and to a crippling flight of capital. Faced with a deflating economy, plummeting tax revenues, a huge surge in black and white unemployment, powerful internal protests that defied the Army's attempts to impose order, and a near total collapse of business confidence, the National Party government in 1990 finally acknowledged the failure of its policy and agreed to negotiate a transition to majority rule. So this is, I guess, the answer to the question with which I began. Why did I write this book? I wrote it because I believe that this story, with all its complex twists and turns, offers us a word of challenge and a word of hope. It outlines the circumstances under which the cold calculus of economic self-interest can give way to a broader concern for human well-being. It counters our sense of futility by reminding us that seemingly inconceivable changes do take place, and that they depend not solely on the evolution of impersonal forces, but also on human imagination and commitment. It invites us to look inward and outward, to ask where in a world in which tyranny and cruelty still abound, we should now apply our energies. And finally, it teaches us that we have control over our ideas, that our ideas have material consequences, and that in the end, as a nation and as a people, we become what we believe. Thank you.
We have time for questions. There is a microphone in the aisle, and I would ask that you use the microphone. C-SPAN is taping this program today for broadcast in a month or so, so it's important that everybody who has a question use the microphone, and I will ask the first question, and then you can just line up at the microphone. Bob, could you talk a little bit about the way in which in South Africa today people are concerned with this history? People are studying the history, taking the history of this period seriously, analyzing it, and teaching it in the schools.
South Africa's history for many years was as segregated as its population. There's a rather moving passage in Nelson Mandela's autobiography where he talks about the difference between going to an English school in the day where he heard all about the triumphs of English colonialism, and then going back in the evening and listening to the stories of great African leaders. I think now what South Africa is doing is trying to construct not just a new and unified nation, but a new and unified history. And that's a very difficult thing to do, given that history in South Africa, as it has been in other places, was put to the ideological purposes of the white government for such a long time. But what's happened, which is extremely encouraging, is that there has been an attempt to gather the materials from the struggle against apartheid in various places, particularly at the University of the Western Cape, and now a national discussion about how South African history should be portrayed and which forces had an influence and which did not, and that's filled with controversy. In fact, now as South Africa is moving forward, there are plenty of people who would like to rewrite South African history and say that the white government intended to hand over power all along. One of the important pieces of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that it is dedicated to finding out some of the stories, no matter how horrific, that have been hidden. And that's a very bold thing to do, and something that I think in the United States we might also pursue.
Bob, the vision of even the possibility that Nelson Mandela might be peacefully elected president of South Africa 10 years ago was impossible to anybody in the world, and it happened. There are undoubtedly several other things that seem to people on today impossible that could happen if we could harness the kind of moral energy that you talked about during this. Would you like, as we really on the threshold of a millennium, a kind of time when we can have people really harness ideals in an unprecedented way, to just mention 2 or 3 things out of this history that you think people in this audience, either in person or by CNN, might really work on to accomplish, and they really could be dreams that would come true the way this did?
I don't know how anyone who witnessed the transformation of South Africa or the fall of the Berlin Wall or the transformation of the Soviet Union could believe that anything in history is absolutely fixed. And I think that there are many, many circumstances now, as you say, where we might look at it and believe that this is impossible or difficult to change, which in fact are far more vulnerable to change than we might think. And I guess one of the things I want to say about this is that apathy serves oppressors. When we say we can't have any effect, we are supporting those who want us not to exercise our power. And that's something that I don't think we should let ourselves off the hook about. If we lived in some other country and looked at the United States with all its power and looked specifically at those of us who are gathered here with all our privilege, we would not say that's a group that can't have any impact. We would say that's a group whose conscience can be ignited and whose actions can have an effect. And so I think that we should look around the world and ask ourselves, of all these countries and places that are clamoring for American support and American dollars or Western dollars, or who want us to separate our economic concern from our principles, I think that's a mistake. I think we should ask those questions loudly. And I'm thinking of places like Nigeria, like Burma, like China, like Afghanistan, many, many different places whose behavior fundamentally violates human rights. So I think we've got plenty of work cut out for us. I was thinking when Robert F. Kennedy spoke that we too are cursed to live in interesting times. I'd like to welcome Lois Pines, Senator Pines.
I'm particularly excited about your book as someone who has fought on behalf of human rights for a very long time. And following up on your comment a moment ago with regard to China, some of us have been very concerned about the administration policy with regard to dealing with the issue of human rights in China. As someone, as a legislator who co-sponsored with Representative Mel King and others, the Massachusetts legislation many years ago that established the boycott. What advice can you, having looked so carefully at these issues over so many years, give to those of us who are in government with regard to formulating a policy that will enhance the human rights in China?
Though I have a tendency to do this and speak about areas that I don't know very much about, I'm not an expert on China. I will say that in my view, we have an obligation to ask questions loudly of our federal government and of the companies that are involved with China to explain to us in detail how the trade or policies they are pursuing will lead to the improvement of human rights in China. And actually, I think that President Clinton would welcome additional pressure from various constituencies around the United States, because it's always easier to negotiate when you have rocks bouncing off your wall than when you don't. I mean, it's just easier to say to Jiang Zemin, I'm sorry, but I have to respond to all of these difficult state legislators and students and others than if there's silence. So again, if we, this is speaking now, Senator, to the question of public reaction. The more public reaction we generate, the more the question is asked and has to be addressed. However, I also think I am not a person who believes, and again, though I'm not an expert, I don't believe that trade automatically creates improvement in human rights questions. I didn't believe it for constructive engagement, and I don't believe it in this case. So I think what I would, if I might be so bold, recommend is that any company that is operating in China spell out, as companies in South Africa were asked to do, how it is that their employment practices and their policies are going to impact local communities to improve access to the fundamental political rights that we consider essential to democratic participation. I don't think that's an onerous burden for our companies to do that. And any way we can find, either legislatively or politically, I would welcome.
Mine is a comment rather than a question. And I want to let your father know that I'm old, so old that I remember reading Collier's. At almost 80 years of age, I see your title more to be tightening the bonds. I see and feel and hear too much of my family did not own slaves, therefore I am not responsible for anything that is happening today. At 80 years of age, I can say that as the grandchild of a slave, much which happened to me in not being able to scale upwardly physically was because of the legacy of slavery, which is still handed down today, and all the cries about affirmative action. I had to tell my children that no matter how hard they studied and how hard they worked, they were not going to receive the compensation that they should have because of the color of their skin. They have had to tell their children, which are my grandchildren, who I have two, one in law school and one in med school, who are receiving all of the snares and the licks and the stones that go with, you're here because of affirmative action. This bothers me greatly that at almost 80 years old, this country, in my emotional thinking, is in the state of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up two points that you raised, and I thought it was a wonderful presentation, and thank you so much for all of your hard work. One is a point that I just wish to undergird your observation about the hypocrisy on sanctions and what the impact of sanctions would be on South Africa. Unfortunately, the country got caught up in a debate as to exactly what numbers, what actual amount of economic damage was caused in South Africa, which really misses the entire point of sanctions, which is that it isn't to cause economic damage, that's the means. The end of it is to cause a change in political thinking. And even though in South Africa, you could argue the numbers, there may have been, depending on how you measure it, large or small impacts because of sanctions, the psychological impact was extremely strong. And I think that's a lesson that we can draw from the South Africa case and apply it to things like the series principles or to companies or any individual investors who are trying to get companies to make change. They may represent a small portion of a company's stock, but they have a big impact psychologically. Second point I wanted to make was, very briefly, is that I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that one of the great pressures that brought an end to apartheid was also a violent one. There was a struggle, an armed struggle. It was not a terrorist struggle as it was described by the Reagan administration, but it was an important part of that entire enterprise. And of course, that also was an aspect of our hypocrisy. At the same time we were funding the Contras under Reagan in Nicaragua, and we were funding insurgents in Afghanistan, we were freezing out the people who were real freedom fighters in South Africa.
Thank you.
Bob, I saw many threads brought together in Loosing the Bonds, and I gather in series you are in conversation with many companies who may be facing human rights issues overseas. And I wonder how your experience and exhortation for us to be concerned with these and to continue to integrate these issues is being addressed within series and among coalition members.
For those of you who may not be familiar with it, Ceres is a coalition of some of the largest environmental groups in the United States, like the Sierra Club, the National Wildlife Federation, the Natural Resources Defense Council, many others, and some of the biggest pension funds in the United States. And this coalition applies some of the same techniques in the capital markets to trying to persuade companies to change their policies and go beyond compliance, but toward genuine improvement. To answer your question, I think as we find ourselves in an increasingly interdependent world based on global trade, one of the critical components of having this trade be a positive thing for humanity rather than a negative thing is to make available to investors and others information that can allow them to make decisions, proper decisions. And that means that we need to have better, not just financial information about what companies are doing internationally, but also social and environmental information. And that's a great movement that we see emerging all over the world right now, to have improved disclosure, to have accreditation of labor practices. We see the explosion of interest in child labor, and many other questions. I think this is a good trend. I think Ceres is playing a particular part in that, but it's something that I would encourage. If you want to know what a company is doing that you're involved with, that you're buying a product from, that you have a stock in, ask, 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 ask.
Sir, at the present time, I believe the OECD is concocting a treaty called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. And I understand that its intent is to insulate corporations pursuing commercial activities overseas from pressure either from a government in any country pursuing its own public interest, or from pressures from citizens and other organizations trying to interfere with what corporations do in third world countries. Can you say anything about the multilateral agreement on investment?
What I know of it is that it is a very bad idea, or at least it has very serious potential consequences. And if I can set it in a slightly larger context, I'd like to suggest that one of the great struggles we're going to face in the future is a question that's already emerged, but that's going to intensify, which is the relationship between the power of great and unaccountable corporations to democracy. And as we see a world increasingly bound together in webs of trade, and as we see companies trying to be fair, trying to, in some ways, find a method of satisfying many, many different concerns, or to avoid their responsibilities, depending on the situation, we see international agreements that have the real potential to damage or to destroy the capacity of democratically elected governments to determine what happens within their boundaries. Unfortunately, this is an area which the Governors Association in the United States has taken up, which of course is dominated by Republicans. So we have an interesting situation where states' rights is now running smack into the question of corporate rights. And that's a debate that I think we would want to fan and encourage. Representative Byron Rushing.
Bob, thank you for your talk, and thank you for this book, and I'm looking forward to getting through the 600 pages. But as you know, Massachusetts has passed a Burma law, and the Burma law is based on the legislation that we passed around South Africa, and we have one international situation that did not exist when the South Africa law was passed, and that is the GATT Treaty. And so we now have the European Commission threatening to take the United States government to a panel before the WTO because of the Massachusetts law. We don't get to sit, we don't get to go to Geneva. I've been trying to get them to talk to us, but they haven't talked to us yet. And a number of American corporations are supporting the European Commission's position. And so what we have, I think, is, and this is my question, we have a number of American corporations taking the same line that they took around South Africa, now around other international pressure points by elected officials and by grassroots organizations. How do we get them? How do we get them to stop doing that? How do we get them converted to the reality of this history?
Let me start by saying that part of the privilege of my current work is that I work with a great many people in a great many different companies, many of whom are very creative and honorable people. So I don't want it to seem that what I'm about to say is applied uniformly to everyone in the corporate world. However, I do believe that as institutions, corporations are constantly seeking to expand their discretion and their ability to act without accountability. And I think that the challenge of citizens and institutions is to reverse that relentless drive. In the case where international agreements can improve human well-being and trade improves human well-being, I'm all for them. But if they are being used as tools to bludgeon attempts by state and federal governments around the world to introduce non-economic concerns, then I think that's an outrage. And I would hope that the President of the United States would rather that the United States lived up to its own principles, and therefore that I'd like to see him stand up to the WTO than to put the United States in the position of abandoning its most deeply held concerns simply for the sake of a slight new upward tick in the Dow Jones. So I think in the end, and let me just say one other thing about this. These economic questions are driven by a language and a technology and a group of people who will inform you that you are not well informed enough to make any questions or raise any issues about these things. It's a kind of a high priesthood that tries to embarrass average citizens into silence. That is the exact opposite of what democracy should be. What democracy should be is that everybody at any place in society should have the right to ask any other person why it is they're acting in such and such a way. And so don't be disempowered by all of the technical language about trade. If you see that you think that a particular event is going to undermine democracy here or elsewhere, speak up. Simon.
Why don't we take 3 more quick questions, and then we can continue the discussion over coffee and cookies out in the lobby, and Robert Massey will sign books, which are on sale at the gift shop. So 3 more questions.
I think you really you hit the nail on the head when you talked about this growing struggle between, on one hand, support for democratic movements around the world, and also our own struggle to remain a self-governing people instead of peoples, and how it is in examples such as this attack at the World Trade Organization against the Massachusetts Burma Law, how corporations are using these trade agreements to actually attack the fabric of democracy itself and to put trade above all other issues, even issues like human rights and the environment. What I think was very useful today, looking back by reading your book about the anti-apartheid campaign, is it does outline the tools that citizens can use, not just to speak out, but also marshal huge amounts of group of individuals used a tactic that was particularly successful, and as a way of sort of illustrating how we can continue to use the lessons that were learned during the campaign against apartheid.
Rather briefly, because this is a big and important topic, two things. One is that I discovered by looking very carefully at how big institutions like Harvard or the Ford Foundation or the New York City Pension Fund responded to this question, that there's actually an interesting dynamic. If you pose a question over and over again to an institution, at some point it feels like it has to come up with an answer. It has to say something to you. And very often, in order to come up with an answer, if they're getting a lot of attention, they have to form a committee, and those committees then talk about this for a very long time. And you can identify, actually, if you look at it over 10 or 12 or 15 years, the way in which those committees actually changed policies was often very incremental. Harvard is a good example. But if you can analyze the institutions that you're involved in your life, if you are involved with any kind of nonprofit or pension fund, if you're a member of TIA, CREF, all different kinds of things, you can identify usually the committee that's discussing this. And you actually have more leverage over that committee than you might think. So I would say identify the deliberative group is the sort of term I would use at the heart of all of these big institutions, and push them hard, because in the end they have to come up with something. Ask them a question like this: how is it that your behavior on this question is consistent with your fundamental purpose as an organization? That will send them into a tizzy for at least a year. And they will come back with something that you can then use again. The other thing is a mechanism that I think activists don't use enough, which is that as shareholders, Americans, whether you're an individual shareholder or an institutional shareholder, can vote on shareholder resolutions, which are proposals that are put forward to the board of directors, or even file them. And if you ever get a proxy or you are part of any institution that has a pension fund for you, you can ask, how are you voting on all of these issues that are flooding through the shareholder system now? Most of us aren't even aware that it exists, but it does exist. It's useful. It's had a big impact. And so I would recommend that whether it's on environmental questions or Burma or child labor or tobacco or any other question that interests you, find out what proxies are being filed and ask how they're being voted. That'll also tie people up for a while.
One aspect of your wonderful presentation this afternoon that you haven't focused on so much is the role of the churches in the anti-apartheid campaign. And especially in the international networks of grassroots organizations that were active on that issue and are continuing to be active on a lot of issues, some of the ones you've mentioned, and some more structural issues like third world debt and very difficult, complex questions. So given your involvement and your experience at Yale Divinity School and at Harvard Divinity School, could you comment briefly on how you see the adequacy of theological education in the United States these days in terms of training people for the ministry in a time when looking at economic justice questions involves some pretty sophisticated knowledge and training? And I think there's been some universities who are trying to look at more cross-disciplinary training for ministry. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I'm a little schizophrenic about it in my answer, and that is that having trained for the ministry myself, I think there are a lot of core traditional things that one should master, and yet at the same time there are these enormous implications for what you are teaching and talking about in the ministry for the wider world. I will point out there was an interesting trend in theological education through the 60s and 70s and 80s, which was to make ministry much more of a privatized function. That is that, and I'm not saying this was bad, in many ways it was a good thing, and that's how you had the growth of pastoral counseling, where the purpose of ministry seemed to be to provide spiritual and emotional support and guidance on a one-to-one or small group basis. I think that's a very valuable service to provide. However, I also think that clergy and others in religious leadership should provide some communal, larger public voice. And so I once went to the dean of Harvard Divinity School after I'd done some training and negotiation at Harvard Law School, and I said, you know, most of the clergy I know are either trying to stir up trouble or calm down trouble, but we don't know anything about negotiation. So why don't we teach a course on this at the Harvard Divinity School? And he said, good luck. And so I did. But that's an example. Thinking these things through, I think, is a very important part. Some churches do it very well. Unfortunately, I will say, and this is the schizophrenic part, some churches do it and that to the detriment of thinking about some of the other deeper spiritual questions that occupy us. But so there should be a balance, and there are certainly opportunities for discussion about this that have not been realized.
Hi. I was sitting here listening to you. I'm really glad that I came today, and something had struck me that I hadn't, through high school, well, middle school maybe not, but definitely not high school, or even my years in college, heard anything about this. This was probably the most I've ever heard about this subject or issue in my entire life. And I turned to the person sitting next to me and mentioned that, and also thought about the fact that my children who are presently in school, who are, they'd like to say adults, but young adults, teenagers, probably haven't touched this and are just learning a little bit about the Martin Luther King era and civil rights, but really not learning the truth about it. And it strikes me as being kind of offensive. And a room full of educators here and probably parents and people. What can we do to change that? I think that the political aspect, the economic aspect, and the social aspect is, but why not hit this range of people, and don't you think that would help to change some of these things? And
it's a very complex question. As somebody who has done some teaching, it's not easy to figure out how to convey such complex lessons in a short amount of time and in a way that captures people's interest. I will say, though, as a way of wrapping up our session today, that I believe at some level we, and this is with all due respect to the elected officials who are here, we see a real failure of political leadership in our country. That is to say that every campaign that we have, every discussion that we have about legislation could be an opportunity for teaching and for a deeper reflection about what it is that we believe in and where we want to go as a community and as a people. And I think that our public officials too often have allowed a system to develop which crushes that kind of discussion. Now, it's not all their fault. We also have a media culture and many other pieces that make it difficult. But time and time again, when we've had the opportunity to raise an issue in its greater complexity, campaigns have focused instead on an issue in its most simplistic, most alarming, most unreasonable aspect. And that's one reason I think that American people are disgusted with politics and aren't voting, because they are just tired of being talked down to, and they're tired of being denied the opportunity for a deeper discussion. So I would hope, and certainly as I listen to Robert Kennedy speak, I would hope that it is possible still for us to turn political debate into something that raises much more profound questions about principle instead of what it has become, which is about the winning of elections. Thank you very much for this time to be with you. I appreciate everyone who came out here, and thank you very much for your interest in this book.
Again, please join us for a cup of coffee and a cookie and further discussion and signing the book.
Next Saturday, April 4th, our monthly 24 Hours About Books. It begins at 8 p.m. Eastern and Pacific with